Welcome to the Omnibus Podcast. I'm Jeremy Munson, a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota. This week on a special edition of the podcast, Walter Hudson and I co-host this episode where we sit down with Action for Liberty's Jake Dusenberg and Dr. Scott Jensen, gubernatorial candidate running against Tim Walz. And we discussed for this entire hour the Unilateral Emergency Powers Repeal Act. This is House File 2204 in the House, being carried in the Senate by Mark Curran. In the House, it's chief authored by Eric Mortensen. I am a co-author on this bill, and we're going to talk about what it really means to change the emergency powers of the governor and what bold stance Dr. Scott Jensen is going to take on this bill, particularly compared to the other softer, less drastic repeal act for the emergency powers. So we'll get into it in this show. It's going to be a great episode. You'll enjoy the conversation. It's unedited and everything is there. So I apologize for any poor audio you hear in this thing, but thank you so much for tuning in to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. All right. Well, thank you, Walter Hudson, for co-hosting another episode. And I want to welcome guests Jake Dusenberg and Dr. Scott Jensen. We're going to do the whole show this week on the governor's emergency powers. And so, Jake, you've been instrumental in the last year on pushing back against the governor's emergency powers and getting people engaged and educated and getting everybody to join the fight.
Yeah, I think Action for Liberty's been in existence. I mean, we helped to get you elected, Munson, in 2018. And, politics, Walter, you know this, politics can kind of drag along and get boring, and we kind of deal with the same old issues. And then March of 2020 came along, and, no one knew what COVID was going to be like, right? It was kind of scary up front. And it was about a week in, and the governor of Minnesota said, you have to stay in your home. He quarantined healthy young individuals. And we go, oh, this is wrong. This is wrong. And so we got on the case right away, and thank God to you and Drazkowski, Munson. You guys pushed a resolution on April 14th. So April 14th. And it wasn't popular back then. Only 15 Republicans voted for it. 15 Republicans voted to end Governor Walz's emergency powers on April 14th. So we went to work. We had to put pressure on those other Republicans, and by the end of April, we had all 59.
Yeah, and it's important to know the first resolution that the old House Republican caucus came forward with was one to say they're going to end the emergency, but they're going to keep all the emergency orders, which wasn't even constitutional.
Yeah,
right?
and locking you in your homes. That was one of them.
Yeah,
businesses were shut down, which in hindsight was a complete mistake. And that's the whole point here is that this is not our constitutional republic. We have to keep our constitutional republic. And we had one guy calling all the shots. And I'm sure we're going to get into this, but we were trying to work with Jensen back in May because the Senate was not helping us out. They weren't giving us a vote. And we asked him to push for a vote to make a motion on the House or the Senate floor. We gave him the move. We showed him how to do it, and he wouldn't do it. And so, that's the thing about Scott, and you're a likable guy, and I like you personally, but, when it really push came to shove and we needed you to be a champion, you weren't there for us. We needed a vote in the Senate. And that was something that was outrageous because we broke for the summer. We didn't know if Governor Walz was going to call us back in 30 days or not. And it was, businesses were shut down and people were still basically, you couldn't go camping. You couldn't go camping if you remember that. So we needed to end those powers then. That was very important.
Well, this is a good conversation. That's why we have Scott Jensen on today. So Scott, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think it's a great conversation, and I'm going to guess that the takeaway for the viewer is going to be that we're all on the same side. We're all trying to accomplish the same thing. I went out to breakfast this morning at 8 o'clock, and we were waiting for the restaurant to open, and the guy says to me, "Are you Scott Jensen?" I said, "Yeah." And we got talking, and his dad was there, and his dad was like 75 years old, and I think a veteran. And he said, "Hey," he said, "I got an email about you last night." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "From a guy named Dusenberg." I said, "Really?" He said, yeah. He said, what's the deal with emergency powers? And I said, well, that's just the thing. I said, Jake and I absolutely both passionately feel like the emergency powers should be a top priority for the legislature now and for any governor in the future. And I said, but it's a question of what roles we're playing. Jake has one role, I have another role. So to go back to the last May, I think, Jeremy, you were instrumental in getting a strong resolution prepared. And you and I talked at the end of April and May. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And we had the big bills at the end of the session, like we always do. And I had asked, I think Friday or Saturday, I'd asked Gazelka, Senator Majority Gazelka, if we could introduce it on Saturday and have a discussion. And he said, well, it's not going to pass. I said, I understand that, but it's really important that we elevate the discussion. He said, we'll try to get it done Saturday. We left Saturday and it didn't get done, and I was frustrated. So I think, Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was driving in because I remember being on 35E North talking with you, and you said, this is what I would do, Scott. And I pledged to you, I will try to do that. Well, then we went into a caucus session, and it was in the Senate building in room 1200. And we probably had the most intense caucus we'd had in weeks. I know that I damaged a relationship with a Republican colleague that I've regarded very highly. And it basically became a little bit of a knockdown. People said, we cannot do this resolution today. We know it's not going to go anywhere. And there are people out there who feel like it's too soon. And I said, doesn't matter. Let's have the discussion. Basically what happened was I felt like I sort of got cornered, and the caucus said, okay, if we whip this, and that basically means we'll check all the senators and see how many people support having the resolution come to the floor. Will you respect the wishes of the caucus? And I can understand where Jake would say, Doc, you knuckled. I get that. But I said, okay, I will honor the caucus. About 2 hours later, I got a phone call, and it was from one of the leadership in that caucus, and they said, you had 6 people stand with you. The other 28 were not. I had a hard time believing that. And yet I had said I would honor the caucus. So I went to Gazelka again and said, can we at least have the discussion? And he said, Doc, you said you'd honor this. So fast forward a month later, and again, we pushed. And that time we addressed it, and it went down. One of my concerns, Jake, let me finish, please. One of my concerns in May had been that if we brought it to the floor, and say I had more than 6 people supporting me, say I had double, say I had 12, then I felt like we would be almost giving a signal to Walz that only 12 of the 35 Republican senators were willing to contest it, and the rest were voting with the Democrats. And I didn't want to do that because I felt that might empower Governor Walz. So whether you agree or disagree with my analysis, I have never disagreed with Jake Dusenberg that this is of the highest priority. And I think Jake has done a wonderful job of leading the way, saying because Jake, and I want you to comment on this too, Jake, there was another time in October or November, I can't remember which one, where again.
Well, hold on, let me address this here, Scott. This is really long. The point is, you do a very good job in the media. Your talking points are great. People love you for it. But when push comes to shove, when you really need to do something, you are literally telling people you took the will of other politicians in a private meeting and wouldn't force a vote. And that's not what a champion does. A champion says, I don't care about the relationships up here with these other politicians. What I care about is going to the people and doing what's right. They wanted a vote on it. And this was a critical vote. We were about to adjourn the whole summer. We didn't know if Governor Walz was going to call him back in 30 days. And you wouldn't do what the people wanted. I think that's a huge failure.
Fair enough.
Let me try to frame that into a question.
You can understand why we're skeptical, right? You can understand why.
Let me try to frame what Jake's saying into a question. And it's legitimately the question I was thinking of before he said what he just said. When you say only 6 Republican senators were willing to go on board with this, as a voter and a constituent, I'd like to know whether or not my senator was one of them, right? And so I think, and I'll let Jake speak for himself, but I think what Jake is getting after with this is exactly that, the accountability piece of being able to go back to the various districts and have the activists, the voters, the constituents know where their elected official stands, so that we in turn can take action to let them know where we stand. Is that a factor that plays into your decision-making process, or is it entirely about the maintenance of relationships at the Capitol?
Walter, that's a great question. Is that a question for me, or did you want Jake to go first?
No, that's a question for
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Jake, you okay if I go ahead?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I definitely got a response to that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, when you in a caucus proceeding, you have 35, and Representative Jeremy Munson knows how this works. You got 35 people, however many people are going to be quizzed. Where are you at? When they do that, they don't tell you who the 6 are. So when I found that out, I thought, frankly, BS. I can't believe that, because I had a dozen of my colleagues come up and thank me after the caucus, even though they knew that it had been a very tense discussion. And they said, "Thanks, Doc, for pushing this." So I was hoping that we'd be somewhere around the middle, because at that point in time, I would have felt comfortable saying, okay, then I'm going to bring it to the floor. When it was 6, I was worried that this would make it difficult for us to get the work that we would get done. I was assured by the leadership that we'd have a chance in June, because we knew that he had to call us back. So I think that from my perspective, Walter, I don't think it was just relationships. I was also concerned that we might be sending a message to Governor Walz that the Republicans were fractured on this question in May. In June, perhaps in part due to Jake's efforts and his organization's efforts, in June, it was a slam dunk. But I agree with Jake. We'd let something pass. We'd let an opportunity pass that unfortunately we shouldn't have. He's right.
There were 3 Democrats that joined in June, and they might have actually joined in May, because it was outrageous what was happening. But Walter, that was a really good question. What our organization does, like we have one mission. We have to end Governor Walz's emergency powers and make sure this never happens again. Okay. We can't fight. We can't do what we want to do unless we know how these people vote. So why are we going up against Julie Sandstone, Dave Lizagard, these con artists who voted one way and voted the exact opposite way? Because Eric Mortensen and Jeremy Munson were willing to force a vote in the Minnesota House to make this happen. All right. But when that doesn't happen, we can't move the ball forward. And so by Scott Jensen not bringing this motion, we had a whole month. We didn't know what that vote was going to be like. By the way, this happened again in November, too. They didn't bring up a vote in November, which was just a huge failure.
Jake, I don't think Eric Mortensen was in the House at that time.
No, I'm talking about January this year. Because remember, we started on January 5th this year, and the numbers worked, right? The numbers were great. We took out 4 Democrats last year on this issue. 4 of the 5 Democrats that lost their re-election were directly our targets, all right? And one of them was Brad Tabke, who was a big yes man for Governor Walz, and we got Eric Mortensen in. So the numbers worked, right? But we didn't know until they actually voted if they were going to actually vote the right way, and we found out that they reneged on that vote.
I'll say,
we never would have forced the vote, wouldn't have known.
In the House, when we were bringing forward the motion, the arguments from the Democrats were, well, the Senate isn't even passing this. The Republican majority in the Senate isn't even supportive of this motion. And I'll admit, people were really frightened at the beginning. I mean, I got a lot of heat from Republicans in the House. Why are you pushing this? It's too soon. People are scared. The majority of Minnesotans supported Walz's lockdown. And so we were just trying to talk about the constitutionality of it. We weren't arguing the science, which I know, Scott, you were doing a lot of, but we were just talking about the freedom, liberty. This is not, this is an imbalance of power. And then it's also important to note that, first of all, for the listeners, this was the election year, right? The power of the Senate was up. If we lost the Senate by pushing, vulnerable Senate Republicans out there and they lost their election, we'd lose everything now. So that was important. There was some political stuff that came into play. But it's, I think that we also need to talk about the lawsuit, because that was extremely bold, right? Suing the governor, because that created a lot of press and a lot of negativity against the 13 lawmakers eventually that signed on. But I think, Scott, you were one of the first ones to sign on to the lawsuit, challenging the governor's, constitutionality of these executive orders.
Let me address that real quick, Munson. So I would love to sue the governor and be successful. We have a fantastic strategy team at Action for Liberty. We looked at all the different things we could do with the governor, recall, impeachment, all those kind of things, right? Because he stepped way out of line. The one thing that did not score well for us was lawsuits, because this might come as a secret to a lot of people. Judges in Minnesota are very liberal. They're not on our side to leave it to unelected people. So the real place to settle the score was the legislature. And that's the thing is, Scott, we had you here. You were willing to put the motion for, or the resolution forward, but you wouldn't get a motion, or you wouldn't make a motion to suspend the rules to get a vote. And that was a massive failure. And that's why, listen, we want you to be successful. Like, I don't know anyone in Minnesota that wants walls gone more than myself, right? But we want to make sure that this never happens again. And the next governor of Minnesota is going to be strong and force this matter to the top, and you won't sign the pledge. So we gave you an opportunity to show us, hey, listen, May of 2020 was a mistake. Sign this pledge. Show the people, 100,000 supporters of Action for Liberty, that you are serious about this. And so far, you haven't signed it.
Yeah. Can I speak to that?
No. Of course you can.
I think that it's until you've walked a mile in someone's shoes, it's hard to know. When it comes to relationships and the caucus and the whole menu of things, I mean, Jeremy, you're correct. We had vulnerable senators that we needed to make certain that they got elected in November to hold the Senate. And we did by the skin of our teeth. So I understand Jake's passion and I appreciate it. But when you're there, it looks a little different. And I wouldn't make any apology for what I did in May. I wish I could have been more perhaps convincing in the caucus, but I couldn't. I tried my best. I think if you talk to any senators that were in the caucus, they would say the same. They said they've never seen Jensen so angry or so motivated. And I wasn't able to get the job done. And the caucus was polled. And I had just a scant number of people that would stand with me. So I elected to stand down. The next month we did it. Now we fast forward to a pledge. And the pledge says that if I were governor, that I would not sign any other legislation until the legislature passes the Unilateral Emergency Powers Repeal Act, also known as the Never Again Bill. Well, I've come out absolutely in support of Representative Mortenson's bill. You're on it, Jeremy. I think it's very possibly, it might need some tweaking. I'm not certain. It's got to go through judiciary. We got to make sure it's constitutional if we can. But the bottom line is, what this is saying that is, as governor, I wouldn't do anything until I sign that. And if I have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate like we do now, the likelihood of that bill getting to the governor's desk is exceedingly small. But it's possible that while that was being debated, there might be a bill like someone reached out to me this morning, the shared parenting bill, which is important to a lot of people. That bill might come from the House and the Senate. And that's a bill that I would want to sign. But according to this pledge, I couldn't. Another bill might be, maybe there'd be a bill that would come from both bodies. Maybe that an anti-mask bill, not allowing a mask mandate to be put into play unless the legislature approved it. And if that bill...
From the Democrats?
Jake,
the Democrats are going to pass that?
I'm not interrupting you. Can we have some common courtesy, please? Or do you want to go ahead, Jake? You go ahead. No, you go ahead, really.
Well, you were using a hypothetical. The Democrats are in control, but they'd pass an anti-mask bill. I can't see that happening.
I didn't say. They say that the masking mandate would be left to the legislature so that we wouldn't have the governor making all these decisions. It might be that the legislature might part and parcel and say, this is part of emergency decision making. This is not. It's impossible to know what would happen. That's why I object to the specific language of the pledge. But the overarching concern for me is about pledges is pledges are more of a way to corral you. And I will have in the next 18 months,
Right.
I will probably have encouragement to sign some, I'm going to guess 30 to 60 pledges. I don't think that's the way a person should run. So I told Jake on the phone yesterday, I said two things that I thought were particularly important. One is I absolutely agree with him. Stripping the emergency powers from Governor Walz is of the highest priority. And I absolutely understand why he's upset that I didn't put the thing on the floor last May. I think that, frankly, I think if he's really interested in seeing Walz given an early retirement program, I think he would try to look at a bigger perspective and say, okay, we got to move on. That's water over the dam. What is Jensen's position now? I don't think I could be more clear on the bill that you've co-signed, Jeremy, that I support it completely. And I also, if the pledge said that I would, as governor, hold as one of the highest priorities getting this done, I would sign that. If I were willing to sign pledges, which I'm not. But
well, I know we don't want to sign pledges. You wouldn't sign the taxpayers' pledge because you ended up increasing taxes on Minnesotans.
I don't sign pledges. I don't sign pledges.
Of course, most politicians. Listen, guys, this is the problem. Is most politicians don't want to sign pledge because their word doesn't mean anything. They need to sign something. They need to pledge to you. That's the whole point in the pledge. You can go and put carefully crafted talking points forward, but until you pledge, you don't give us certainty. And this is a big deal in Minnesota. The taxpayers' pledge is a huge thing. You guys are instructed not to sign that thing. And the reason is it puts you in a box so you actually can work with the Democrats to increase taxes, which you literally did, Scott. You voted for a tax increase in 2019. So that's why pledges are so important. It shows that you are really certain you are going to pledge these people this is what you're going to do.
Walter, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, actually.
He's not running for office.
No, and we'll take all the time we want to get Scott's perspective and to reply to that. My question for you, Jake, on pledges, and just for the record, I also technically am a politician. I'm a city council member in the city of Albertville. And
good one too, by the way. He passed the resolution.
I did move forward a resolution in our city to try to nullify the governor's executive order. Unfortunately, we don't have like-minded people on the council up here, but I did get a vote, and we know who they are.
and don't sell yourself short. Chelsea, working with Chelsea.
Yep.
Down in the city, Ramsey. There's some leaders there.
But on this topic of pledges, though, I have a legitimate, sincere question as to what we're trying to affect with them, because I understand the idea of trying to corral people into taking certain actions and being able to call them out when they fail to do so once they're elected to office. The specificity of this particular pledge, as Scott articulated, is something that would give me pause if I was being asked to sign it. And the reason why is, we have this thing called the open meetings law in Minnesota that applies to municipal government. It doesn't apply to state government, but it applies to the cities, the school boards. And what it says, in essence, is a couple of things. One, that you can't have a quorum of a body get together in somebody's backyard and talk about public policy and decide what they're going to do before there's an actual public meeting where constituents can come and be privy to the deliberation. The other thing that it says is that we're actually legally obligated as council members to not walk into a deliberation with our minds made up about a particular issue. Now, is that something that you can enforce? Probably not. But I've always attempted to at least follow the spirit of that. And by that, I mean, even if I'm the one making the motion, right? Like in the case of the resolution to nullify Governor Walz's executive order, I'm going in open to a good argument. Like, if you can make a good argument why we shouldn't do this, and it's solid and it's the right thing to do, I'm not going to vote the wrong way just because I walked in the door saying I was gonna. The capacity to change your mind is something that is not only, part and parcel to the individualism I know we all stand for, but it's also something that I believe you owe your constituents. Like, you have to be willing to consider in good faith arguments for or against a certain course of action. I'm wondering to what extent pledges like this, including the taxpayers' pledge, really kind of circumvent that to where you don't have the opportunity to, in good faith, consider the merits of a particular proposal.
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, we know Scott Jensen's willing to make pledges ahead of time because he pledged to the politicians in a private caucus meeting he wouldn't make the motion on the Senate floor. So we know you're willing to make pledges to politicians. What we're asking is to make pledges to the people. So what is the pledge? Is the pledge that I will support the Constitution? Would you have any problem with that? Would you pledge that I will never expand abortion? There are some things out there that I think we all have our minds made up on. You can fault us for that, but honest to God, this stuff's been sorted through. We've had debates on this. We've had the conversation, and we know where we stand on it. And this is one of those issues. We know where we stand on this issue.
Jake, I didn't hear your answer to Walter's question.
What did you not hear? I'm surprised.
Would you repeat the question?
Well, there was a lot of setup in there. The core of the question, the core of the question is, do these pledges prevent elected officials from being able to consider in good faith the merits of a particular proposal?
Yeah, I mean, well, once again, I think I was answering the question in the sense that would you pledge to support the free markets and be against socialism?
Jake, that's not an answer. You're asking a question. You're answering a question with a question. You're being very.
I thought you don't like interrupting.
Question, Scott. Jake.
Like
the question is a yes or no question. You're being a politician.
I'm not a politician. You're the politician.
And that's why I told you yesterday, maybe you should throw your hat in the ring and you should run for governor.
Would you like that? Would you like me to get in there?
Get into the arena with me, please.
It would be fun to be on the stage with Governor Walz. That would be I think that would get a lot of
You can't keep coming back 11 months later and sort of cherry picking at me on this issue. Come on into the arena, Jake. Really.
You're a politician. You're a politician. I'm not the one running. You're the politician. Your record's out there. You're a 23%.
Jake.
You're a 23% lifetime rating on our scorecard. You're
all right. I'm gonna interrupt here just to say, nobody's gonna be able to hear any of this because the way it's recorded technically, if there's people talking over each other, we're not going to be able to differentiate who's saying what. So you guys need to take.
Okay,
turns.
Then can we ask Jake to give us an answer to your question without asking a question, please? Yes or no?
Well, so so in my position as moderator that I've been placed in here, what I interpreted Jake as saying is what he's saying is that there's certain overriding principles that we all agree with. I don't think anybody disputes that. The issue with this particular pledge is that it's not just saying, do you think the governor's unilateral executive power should end? That's a principle that would be analogous to, are you going to expand abortion? Yes or no? This is specifically saying, are you going to make this pre-existing bill that's been authored with this text your singular priority and not pass anything else until it comes to your desk, despite the fact that you have no ability to know between now and when you might be elected what the circumstances are going to be, what the constitution of the two legislative bodies is going to be, whether or not there's going to be a conference committee, or all of these factors that nobody can predict. It's taking the general and making it extraordinarily specific and then saying, here, promise me this is going to happen.
Yes, and one candidate so far, is two candidates that are in this race. One candidate said yes to that. This is what hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans over the last year, tons of conversations I've had, phone, email, talking to these business owners, Larvita down in Lynn, Minnesota, Jane up in East Grand Forks, Lisa down in Albert Lee, these people who are currently being pursued by our government right now. Like Jane just lost her liquor license for 60 days. This is a conversation with these people saying, this is what we need. This is what we need. It's a simple pledge. This is the top priority. Nothing will get done. The way that we look at this, Scott, is we have lost a republic in the last year. And I know a lot of your people, your supporters, feel that way. the Democrats at this point in the Minnesota House, Jeremy probably laughs at this, they talk about democracy, they talk about democratic process. They don't believe that. They clearly don't believe it. They right now have Governor Walz with unilateral emergency powers for one thing, convenience sake. That's it. So we've lost our republic. This is so important. That's why we heightened it to this level. And a pledge affirms that this is the number one thing you're going to do. Why would you sign a 2-year budget? Why would you do that? Why would you fund the government that's literally attacking our citizens right now until we rectify this issue?
Question?
Go ahead.
Representative Munson, this pledge says that you would refuse to pass a budget bill. You would let the disabled and the challenged potentially lose their support structure. You would allow 20% of Minnesotans to have to go without health care. You would close down state parks. You would close down state offices. You wouldn't be able to get titles for your cars. All of these things are in the pledge that Jake wants signed. Would you sign this pledge, Representative Munson?
Well, I'll just answer that with the politics of this, and I've expressed concerns on this pledge too, and it is because it's so specific, but it's also because I'm a co-author of the bill. I think it's great. It addresses some really important things. The most important thing is that there's a lot of bad emergency power reform bills coming out that like take away the legislative veto, but still allow the governor for 30 days to write law unilaterally, impose fines on his new laws, put people in jail on his new laws. And then if he wants to, at the end of 30 days, he can end his emergency and then reissue one an hour later, and he has another 30 days. He never has to go to the legislature. It's a major loophole that all of the other emergency power reform bills don't address. This one does. And I think that's why it's important that we have to remove the governor's ability to write law unilaterally, or at least be enforced as law, and to empower the legislature to not have a constitutional veto. I love the 2/3 majority part. Those things are really important. To say that this bill has to pass before anything else, I think it's important. But you're right. The attack ads coming against you will say, Dr. Scott Jensen has vowed to, end your health care unless this happens. You know what I mean? So they're gonna attack it. But I'm not somebody who's afraid to shut down government. If I could, we know when we say the government shuts down, it actually doesn't shut down. It's just the non-essential workers shut down. And as far as I'm concerned, I could go home. Then my job is done. You know what I mean? Like I'm okay with a shutdown, but I understand how it gets spun in the media that you're going to be, throwing grandma out of the nursing home and all these things because you refuse to sign this bill.
And this is such an important point: is they're going to attack you no matter what. That's their talking points. You guys all know the talking points. It doesn't matter if you sign the pledge or not. They're going to attack you on that anyhow. What the pledge does is it affirms to the base that you seriously prioritize this issue. And I think we have to learn, from Trump in 2016, one of the reasons he propelled right to the top, regardless of what you think of Trump in the end, he propelled to the top because he basically took a pledge to actually build the wall. And that was a huge issue to the base. They loved him for it. He went right up the top over Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio. They looked terrible because none of those guys were going to say that. And he ended up winning the election. And the media was definitely not on his side. I mean, I think that's a matter of record at this point. The media wasn't on his side. So the media knows their talking points. They're going to do it. The Democrats know their talking point. Those two are kind of the same, by the way. They know their talking points are going to come after you. But what I want to see, and I know there's so many Minnesotans, disenfranchised Republicans, they want to see a guy on our side willing to stand up and face it head on. And I don't feel like that's you, Scott Jensen, because going back to May, when we first started working with you, you were afraid to do that. You wouldn't bring up that resolution on the Senate floor. That was a very important thing. You won't sign the pledge. I mean, for God's sakes, you signed universal background checks. You gave the Democrats or the left, the anti-gun people, a huge win. Now we got a bipartisan bill. I think there's a lot of things on your record right now that give a lot of us pause to say, hey, I don't think this guy's really going to be our fighter.
But before we transition into talking about Second Amendment rights, Scott, let me frame the question to you like this. So the last time we had you on, you made a statement to the effect that you didn't commit to it, but you said you were considering making emergency powers an issue that was your top priority and that you wouldn't sign anything else until the legislature did something on emergency powers. Now, that's a little bit more vague than the pledge that you were asked to sign here, but it's similar. So my question is, what type of a pledge would you sign? Like, what's the most specific pledge that you would put your name on and say, this is what I'm going to do if I'm elected governor?
I think that's a great question. One thing we do in the Senate that I think, Jake, you might learn something from is we don't try to identify what someone's motivation is, because when you do that, generally it disintegrates from a conversation into sort of attack. But maybe that's the intent. But I think that you said you were afraid. It isn't afraid. Just because I didn't do what you wanted shouldn't necessarily imply fear. There might have been other considerations going around in my head that you're not aware of. So I would ask for that small amount of grace. But to your question, Walter, and Jeremy, I never heard whether or not you would sign this pledge when I asked you that question, just for the record. But to your question, Walter, I think I would be willing to say that I would not sign a piece of legislation in the month of January or February unless it was considered an emergency piece of legislation. I would not sign anything until the emergency powers bill came to my desk. And I would be willing to freeze the legislature for a period of time. But I need to make certain that I'm not removing the health care from a lot of people. I'm not putting the disabled people with their PCAs out of business, and that we would still do one of those basic responsibilities of government, which is a budget every 2 years without shutting government down. So would I be willing to do something like that? Absolutely, because to me, the emergency powers thing is incredibly important. But I do bristle at Jake's hubris in regards to sort of sitting in the sidelines. Go and run, Jake. Get in the race. Identify.
How am I on the sidelines?
I think people would want, because then you give up your ability to sort of be the Monday morning quarterback and just snipe. Then you're actually in the hunt and you have to work with others. And that's important.
It's so funny you say I'm on the sidelines. I'm literally in this fight. I've been in this fight since back in March. Like we literally have 5 door knockers right now on the Iron Range working in the area to deliver the votes for this overall ticket to take out con artists like Julie Sandstead. We've been in the trenches since last March. I mean, it's been over a year. I don't know what you mean by on the sidelines. Not everyone in politics has to run for office.
Jake,
not everyone has to run for office.
Why don't you throw your hat in the ring? What prevents you from doing that?
I don't know. It's a good idea. Maybe I should, Scott.
Hey, I want to weigh in here because as I've been thinking about this conversation more and more, something has really crystallized in my head. What we're really asking the governor, the potential governor, right? As governor, you are willing to say the first bill you need to send to my desk is a bill that takes away power from me.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing in this emergency powers bill that empowers the governor. Everything it does is take away power from the executive branch and give it to the legislature. There is not one Democrat or Republican in the legislature who should oppose that, unless it's a Democrat. If we have a split legislature, and I want to remind everybody that Minnesota is the only state in the entire country with a divided legislature, where Republicans control one body, Democrats the other. And the only reason that is because we have some districts that are imbalanced, where we have more people in one district than the other. This cycle, we're going to be redistricting. So we're rebalancing all the legislative districts. So next year, everything should be very well balanced, and we likely will not have a divided legislature. So that's going to be rare. But even if Democrats control the House and Senate and we elect a Republican governor, which is very, very slim chance, of course, the Democrats are going to want to take more power away from a Republican governor. And if it's Republicans that control the House and Senate, which is the most likely, scenario, if we're electing a Republican governor, of course the Republicans are going to want to take control from the governor. It doesn't matter to them, but they would rather take it back because of the rare chance we have a Republican governor in this state. So I don't think it's going to be an issue to get this bill through, no matter what it is. And this is very clear. It's taking away power from the executive branch and bringing it to the legislature. Self-interested politicians are always going to want to do that. this is not going to be an issue passing.
Yeah, I was thinking about
yes, I would sign this because there should be no problem on sailing this one through.
You would sign the pledge, Jeremy.
I would sign the pledge because,
you should run for governor.
Well, but I mean, one of the concerns I have about this specific bill, and that's what the pledge is, it's this language, is that I have not went through all the scenarios. If 2 a.m. a tornado hits, this bill says that the governor can't declare an emergency. Only 2/3 of the majority of the legislature must. And I don't know if there's a 4-day waiting period to call the legislature back into session if it's July, right?
Not.
Okay,
not in the
we do need to change the rules to allow Zoom and all that kind of stuff to allow legislators to get back in to vote for stuff. But once this passes, really the only emergencies that should be authorized are for real emergencies like tornadoes, floods, fires, that kind of stuff.
And that's the beauty of this bill that Mort crafted, is that it's not political, right? If it's so obviously an emergency, 2/3 are going to sign it, right? And the legislature, we know the legislature can do this because, there's actually a part of the Constitution. I love talking about the Constitution because the legislature picks and chooses what parts of the Constitution they want to follow. And in the Constitution, it says that the legislature has to be at the seat of the government, which is St. Paul. They're not doing that. So Mort challenged us on the House floor a couple times. Remember this, Munson?
Yep.
He challenged it. And it was ruled by the speaker that we can still conduct business even if we're not all in St. Paul. We know that this can be done, even if it's 2:30 in the morning. If the governor has to wake up 2:30 in the morning, so can the 134 members of the House. And we can get this done because if it's so apparent it's an emergency, this will get done.
And I agree with Jake. I agree that this bill is very important, and I would sign it in the first 5 minutes it got to my desk, without question. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think that, I'm sorry, I just want to cut in that if you want to explain what this is to people, it's empowering the voice of the people, right? The legislature is the voice it's the most representative form of government. And it's basically saying, I trust you as a voter in the people that you elect to make decisions to help run government. And is this bill pretty extreme? It is. It really restricts the governor, but Walz ruined it. He honestly ruined it. We trusted him and he has ruined it. So he's going to be the governor. The office of the governor is going into the penalty box for at least 8-12 years to restrict that person, right?
That was very Minnesota of you. That was very. What's really interesting is the. Do you know that there was two consecutive terms for the president of the United States, and you know why that was originally? It's because George Washington didn't run a third time. It wasn't until FDR ran 4 times, and he died early in his 4th term, where they passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution saying, no, you can only run for 2 terms, right? So, it is incumbent upon us to limit the executive branch. And that's the spirit of America, is that we do not have a powerful executive branch.
And I would actually go a step further, and I would say that I would sign that bill, but I would also like to see it put on the ballot as a constitutional amendment so that it can't be reversed easily. Because I think that would be the other step, is to really put it into something where you can't have tampering from the legislature if you get the majority flipping. And so I think that what we've lived through the last year, we should never again live through this again. And I think that Jake says it's absolutely right. We need to balance the power between the legislative and the executive branches. And it's absolutely obscure. And the fact that Governor Walz has made it very clear that he's willing to use executive powers now as a negotiating tool as the legislature tries to finish up its next 6 weeks of work. That should give every Minnesotan pause. I don't care if you're liberal, conservative, independent, or whatever. The fact that he has said that he's willing to talk about this means it's very clear that he wants to use it as a negotiating tool. We had a $30 billion budget for the biennium in 2009 and 10, and now we're having a proposal for $53 billion. And it's a 70% increase in 1 decade. And he's going to use this emergency powers to get his way. Unbelievable. So Jake, I understand.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point. What Scott Jensen's saying right now is absolutely what's happening. The only reason that Governor Walz has emergency powers right now is they want a better bargaining chip. And the second part of that pledge, and I think that's a key one, is Scott Jensen, who was in the Senate and is right now maybe the lead candidate for governor in the Republican ticket, we want you to call upon the legislature. Will you call upon your former colleagues in the Senate and say, don't pass this 2-year budget. Don't fund the Department of Health that's literally attacking our businesses right now until we pass this thing.
And I understand. And then the third bullet in this pledge is that as governor, I will never use emergency powers to infringe on the rights of Minnesotans. In principle, I absolutely agree with that, but I am concerned about, and I have, Jake, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I've met with several of the restaurant owners who've been shut down out of business, and I'm working with their attorneys trying to help. What's that?
Which
Interchange
ones?
with Lisa. Mike Padden.
Okay.
Mike Padden. I mean, he's been here in my office. Lisa's been here in my office. I'm trying to help them in any way I can. I've done videos of restaurants that are going down. I think there were 95 restaurants in the Minneapolis area that are closing and won't ever reopen again. But I think that what infringing on someone's powers or on their rights means, if we have a flood or a tornado and all of a sudden there's a tremendous amount of ransacking and pillaging and things like that, and the governor makes a decision, okay, we've got to have the National Guard come in and we've got to stop this, everybody's got to get home, is that arguably infringing on someone's rights? So I think that I really do appreciate Jake's passion. I don't appreciate his methodology, but I appreciate his passion. And I think that for me, stripping away, and I think that I have no interest in having the kind of power and authority that Governor Walz has seemed to be so attracted to. I don't have any interest in that at all. And that's why, as governor, I would absolutely sign that bill, because I think it's wrong to have this, as you said, Jake, this imbalance between the executive and the legislative branches. And the executive branch, I mean, you can have one person that's power hungry, like we have, and look at all the things he's doing with it. I mean, he's violated HIPAA rights. He's had the ACLU come against him. He's had Democrats come against. I mean, he's behaved like a Newsom and Cuomo lookalike. So I'm with you all the way there, Jake. Really. What's that?
With flannel.
So
he loves that red flannel shirt. He loves that thing. But did I hear you right? You literally want an opening to infringe on people's rights?
No, you didn't hear me right.
You were talking about like sending the National Guard in? You said, I'm confused. I thought you said you were like, box you in on that?
No, Jake. No, you misheard. It says on the third bullet that I will never use emergency powers to infringe on the rights of Minnesotans. Well, someone could say that if you send the National Guard in to clear out an autonomous zone or to stop a riot, that's infringing on their right. So I think that third bullet point is, to me, it's mushy. It's open to interpretation. And that's another reason why I wasn't impressed with the language of the third bullet.
Is that someone that would say that you?
Excuse me?
Is that someone that would say that you?
No.
Well, Jake, you know, I mean, one of the emergency powers today is that allows the governor to declare an emergency for civil unrest. If what happened during the George Floyd, protests, I think everyone would agree that the governor should have the ability to bring in the National Guard, to bring, to declare, curfew, to, stop people from burning buildings down. And
that's not you don't have a right to burn a building down.
You have a right. You have an absolute right to be out there protesting. And in fact, federal courts have found, lockdowns and curfews to be unconstitutional. Right. I mean, there's a balance there. We have to understand that,
correct.
So the governor.
I don't want you to complain about issues though. Like, I don't see what the issue is here. The National Guard could be called in because there's massive civil unrest of people breaking the law. You don't have the right to break these laws. I mean, Walter speaks very fluently on this issue. These people are literally shutting down Interstate 35. They can be arrested. That's not infringing on people's rights, right? That's the whole idea of liberty, is you don't have the right to infringe on someone else's property or on someone else's life or limb. So I don't see where the conflict is.
Don't you really?
By the way, Scott,
Jake, you really don't see where the conflict is? I mean, Jeremy just articulated. If the National Guard comes in and puts a curfew in place to stop unrest, can you see where some people would say, you're infringing on my right to demonstrate?
Correct. We should not be able to stop someone's right to demonstrate.
Well, then you disagree, Representative Munson, that the National Guard has the right to come in as an emergency in civil unrest and do something like that. That's what Jeremy said.
I don't know if Jeremy stands for that. I doubt he does, but that's a right that's protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and actually in the Bill of Rights of Minnesota. You have the right to assemble. You have the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. That's a very important right. So no, the National Guard does not have a right to take that away from you.
On the freeway, though? What about on the freeway? Because I have heartburn when we talk about...
People have a right to travel. People have a right to move about their life. So
that's what Jeremy's speaking to.
That's the thing about liberty. That's the thing about liberty.
Would you think that Jeremy's right or wrong?
Do you support curfews? We'll just put it that way. Would you support an 8 p.m. curfew being in place for a week after civil unrest?
I think that's way too much power for government to have. Okay. Absolutely. It's too much power for government to have. Liberty, the thing about liberty is you don't have a right to infringe on someone else's property or their travel or their people. So that is actually, I mean, that is, I think that's pretty codified into law here. So I don't know where the issue is. If someone's blocking a freeway, that is not a right that's protected.
So basically you're saying, and you're telling the people in your organization, Jake, that if buildings are being burned and the 3rd precinct is being burned and the National Guard is called in for the emergency of civil unrest, that they don't have the right to issue an emergency curfew and tell people, you got to get off the streets. You're saying that they get to continue to burn the buildings. Is that what you're saying?
No, of course I'm not saying that. That's ridiculous.
Maybe you should run for governor and get in the arena.
You're the one running for governor. I don't know why you're asking me that question. That's ridiculous. No one thinks that they have a right to burn it.
By the way, right to do a curfew.
Yes, yeah, a curfew on it. Yes, you can quell civil unrest in more ways than just saying you can't leave your home at 8 p.m. That is not a right government should ever have. That's a terrible right.
Okay,
and that's what walls did to us.
Okay.
Pandemic. You can't leave your home.
No curfew is the decision by Action for Liberty. The governor can't put a curfew in place. He can just stop people after they've committed crimes.
No, of course not. You can, just like any cop, you would love for them to stop someone in the act of committing a crime, right? Or if there was evidence that they're about to commit a crime. Of course.
So they can infringe on someone's rights then, Jake. Okay, now I understand what you're saying.
I don't know how they're infringing on rights. Once again, rights, you can't take someone else's property.
So
you can't harm another individual. I don't know what you're trying to say, Scott.
This has been an example of parsing over the particulars of language to try to figure out what it means. And as I see it, in the context of what we're talking about, which is a pledge for an election for a particular office, the people who ultimately get to decide what those planks mean of that pledge are the voters, the constituents, right? Because you're making a pledge to the voters. Right. And so the question isn't necessarily how Jake or Jeremy or Scott or Walter see the individual applications of individual rights. It's what the voters see as their own individual rights. So it'll be up to them to determine whether or not an 8 p.m. curfew or deploying the National Guard or whatever particular manifestation we're considering is a violation of that pledge. Scott, to bring it back to the pledge, because it's kind of interesting in light of what we were talking about earlier about open meetings and not making up your mind. I've been moved a little bit during the course of this conversation about the strategy of this pledge. It didn't make sense to me when I walked into this conversation. But consider this hypothetical. So you sign the pledge. You get elected. You get this backlog of great legislation that funds things that you think government ought to do, legislation that limits governments in ways that we all think it ought to be limited, stuff that's got broad public support, but you're not seeing this never again bill. The legislature's not moving on executive powers. This is the nightmare scenario, right? Where there's all this stuff that you would love to sign, but you can't sign it because you pledged you were only going to do the executive powers thing first. Now, thus far, we've imagined all of the attack ads about all of the constituents who aren't going to be getting the services that they're due because of the governor's intransigence. Doesn't it also work the other direction? Like, couldn't you put pressure on the legislature to say, I'm ready to sign every single one of these bills that's stacked up on my desk. And all you have to do is take away my power. Isn't that a powerful narrative that ought to be able to provide some leverage to the legislature to get that job done?
I think you're absolutely right. It's tremendously powerful leverage. And I would want to be able to use that. But you can't know what is going to happen. And you can't know what the complexion is of the legislature. So if I've got bills on my desk that are going to ensure the continuation of healthcare services for my patients and for the disabled, am I going to play a game of chicken? I think that's almost what you're asking. I wouldn't. I would make certain that those people had their healthcare, that if we had a shared parenting bill that would clear the courts out of a lot of these things, I couldn't play that game of chicken. But I think that's one of the things about being in the arena versus not, is you don't get to play that game of chicken. I could have played the game of chicken last May. And I said, nah, I can't. But I understand. I mean, I think one of the most important takeaways for the viewer of this podcast is that we have 4 people here I think are pretty articulate and pretty engaged. And without question, I'd say that Jake is far more knowledgeable than me in terms of the actual wording of the Constitution. But I think we're all saying the same thing. We think that Governor Walz has abused emergency privileges. We think that he's going to use it extremely inappropriately as a negotiating tool in the coming weeks. We think that this is going to make it more difficult for the Senate Republicans to hold the line on spending. We're spending money like there's no tomorrow. There are so many other issues that the idea of issuing an ultimatum and then playing chicken would not be something I would do as governor. And if someone felt like that was enough for them to not support me, then they shouldn't support me.
I think that's what's going to happen because that's what people want you to do. I talked to the base, the grassroots activists all across Minnesota, and that's what they're tired of seeing is Republicans who don't stand up. And I think what you're articulating is that you're not willing to stand up on the most important issue out there. I don't think there's an issue signing this pledge. I think this shows that you're strong, that you're willing to go up against the Democrats. You could call it playing chicken. I call it standing firm on the most important issue of the day. That's what we're asking you to do. It's not me. It's hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans that are supporting Action for Liberty. I'm sure you're hearing this on the road as you go to Minnesota. That is such an important issue. And I think that sets you aside. And I think you say a lot of the right things, Scott. But once again, talk is cheap in this game. We hear politicians say things all the time. Pledges affirm that you won't increase taxes, which you did.
I would remind you
that you follow the Constitution. You vote for omnibus bills, which are clearly violations of the Constitution. So I think there's a reason you have an F rating on our scorecard. But I'm ready to let bygones be bygones. We want to see you, and I sincerely hope you rethink this and sign this pledge.
Yeah, I think that one of the things is in a court of law, both signed documents as well as video documents are admissible by evidence. So I think, Jake, you've gotten a little hung up on your verbiage and your pledge. And I actually don't think it represents all the people in your organization, because I spoke to 100 people last night, and quite a few of them, we talked about this and this morning. So, I think you're sort of creating this dyad, if you will. It's Jake Dusenberg and Scott Jensen. I would be interested, if you really are willing to put it all on the line, why don't you issue this pledge to all 201 legislators and ask them to sign it? And then go to your organization and say, if you were governor, would you sign this pledge? And see how many of your organization actually said, yes, we would sign it. Because I think there's a lot of thoughtful people in Action for Liberty that would say, no, I can see where this really wouldn't be the thing I want to do. I think what your people would say unanimously would be, get behind Eric Mortensen's bill. That's important. And I would agree. And I went so far as to say that I would also say that I would be willing to freeze any legislation the first month, waiting for the stripping of the emergency powers bill to come down the desk. But that I wouldn't be willing to freeze all the work that needs to be done in a legislative session. I think that would be an irresponsible act on the part of an elected official.
Will you call upon the Senate right now to not pass a 2-year budget. Give Walz his fully funded government until they pass this bill.
Say that again, Jake, please.
That's the second bullet point on that pledge. Will you call upon the Senate Republicans right now to not pass a 2-year budget until they pass the Unilateral Emergency Powers Repeal Act, the Never Again bill?
That's a really good question.
You're talking about this session, like right now.
This session, right now. He just talked about how Governor Walz is hijacking the whole budget, and that is 100% true. Scott is completely right on that. So will you call upon the Senate Republicans right now to not cave to the Democrats, pass a 2-year budget until they end Walz's emergency powers and pass the Never Again bill?
Jake, and I'm trying to deflect. I will answer your question. But in light of where we're at with this pandemic, and I don't think there's any emergency there, I would call on the Senate to do what you just said. I would say, play hardball. If you can make it so that you can shut down government, start doing the planning now so that the people that are in the shadows of life, the title stuff, the stuff that Jeremy mentioned earlier, it can still go on. Prepare for it. But put it out there right now. We're not going to pass a budget without the emergency powers he's got to give them up or strip it away. I would agree with you. I would call on the Senate to do that.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, I think I want to thank you guys all for participating in this conversation. I actually had to change. Huh? Well, I had a change of thought during this conversation because I thought that getting this passed as Governor Jensen would be difficult. But really, the more I think about it, there's no reason why the legislature wouldn't pass this, stripping the executive branch of power, unless they're thinking long-term when the Democrats take the governor's office again. But legislators don't think long-term. So I think it really would be easy to strip
Quick
back.
question, Jake. Jake, what do you think about putting it on as a constitutional amendment so that it can't?
No.
Why not?
No, we have a republic. We make you guys do the work. Don't bring this to a ballot issue.
I would do that. I would pass the bill. But then in addition to it.
Well, if it's already passed, then why would you tamper with it?
Because the legislature can reverse it the next session.
Scott, I would argue that it's already in the Constitution.
Right.
We already have, and I hate doing that because people always we already have this requirement in our Constitution, and our legislature still doesn't follow it. Right? Our courts don't follow it. So adding more stuff to a list of things that people don't even follow in the first place is wrong. I think so. That's what I would. It's unnecessary. We have 3 co-equal branches of government. We have the non-delegation doctrine. Legislature shouldn't be giving the governor the authority to write law, and they still did. So,
closing statement, and I got to run. Okay, I agree with Jake Dusenberg. I call upon the legislature to not pass a budget until the emergency powers has been stripped away.
And the Never Again bill passed?
Excuse me?
And they passed the Never Again bill?
Yeah, because I would say that ending the emergency is part of the negotiation that will happen at the end of session, but it's not going to prevent the governor from reissuing the emergency in June.
Scott, I look forward to our tour to go around Minnesota on this issue right there.
Thank you.
Okay, Walter, you got any final words?
Well, I wasn't going to say this, but I will since you asked. One of the things that I find fascinating about this entire conversation is that it all emerges from the fact that we, and by we I mean our side, actually take these things seriously.
Yes.
We care about whether or not somebody means what they say when they put their name on a piece of paper or when they put their hand on the Bible and take an oath. Or whether or not they're going to abide by the intent and meaning of the Constitution. And it's because we care about that we can sit here for an hour and deliberate the nuances of what that even means. The Democrats don't care about that at all. They never mean what they say. They never have any intent of following through on the text of anything that they sign or pledge an oath to, especially the Constitution. And that's been exhibited by Governor Walz's behavior during this entire episode, where he's, as we pointed out, he has used his executive powers as a, not for even their expressed purpose. And I mean, expressed by him. He says he's using them to protect people from COVID-19, but in actuality, he's using them as a strategic tool to push his political agenda in the legislative session. That is reprehensible. And that's the kind of thing that won't happen if a Governor Scott Jensen gets elected or any Republican governor gets elected, because we take this stuff seriously.
If I could add on to that, I apologize, Walter, but you're absolutely right. And to Jake's point, I think if you look at what's happened so far in the legislative session, which is close to nothing, and you look at what Governor Walz's budget proposal is, and the House Democrats, and they even increased, I think this is a perfect time to do exactly what Jake is asking. Don't pass a budget bill until the emergency powers have been stripped away and the bill gets passed so we can just put it in place again. Do I have second thoughts about what I did last May, Jake? Absolutely I do. I mean, there's probably a handful of issues that I wrestle with. And am I learning all the time? Absolutely. So thanks for the conversation, Jake.
Again, I want to thank you for tuning in to the Omnibus Podcast this week. I think it's been a really interesting discussion on emergency powers. I really enjoy getting people on the show who have differing views on things and let them work through their differences and on important issues like this. And I think it went really well. Maybe next week we can get Rob Dorr and Ben Dorr to sit down and hash out their differences on gun rights activism here in the state of Minnesota. So thank you again for tuning in to the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.